All right, now let's look at prosocial positive emotions, such as compassion. How can we cultivate these emotions? We've all heard the edifying homilies and inspirational stories that effectively say, be more compassionate, loving, forgiving, and so on. It would be preaching to the choir to rehearse those. What's rarely heard is how to become like that. We're going to apply our model of emotion in order to see what needs to change in order to experience more of these positive emotions in our lives, namely the appraisal conditions under which they do or do not arise. We'll look at several groups of techniques for fostering it, techniques which find ready examples in many traditionally religious practices. And compassion is going to serve as our example of a highly valued positive emotion, but of course, there are others one might seek to cultivate, such as agape or unconditional love as sought by Christians, or the equanimity sought by Hindus. So our exploration of compassion can serve as a pattern or template for exploring a range of positive prosocial emotions. Okay, first we should consider carefully what the emotion is so we understand what we're talking about and what it feels like to experience it. Compassion is a feeling that arises in witnessing another's suffering and that motivates a subsequent desire to help. It's different from kindness, which moves us to help regardless of suffering, and also different from pity, which responds to suffering but without the desire to help. Compassion generally has an unpleasant sensation where you feel the other's pain and focuses attention in prosocial directions. And you can get a felt sense of what compassion feels like easily by first imagining someone you care about, visualizing them in detail for several minutes, and you may feel a warm feeling toward them. Then picture them experiencing difficulty. Notice any changes in sensation in the body or changes in attitude. Sometimes the experience of compassion feels more visceral, other times more mental. And it's important to note that compassion can take different forms. The compassion of a school teacher might look very different than that of a drill sergeant, which in turn might be different than that which appears when we bond over the common human existential condition of living in a universe that involves some suffering. Now that's easier said than done, of course. So next we need to apply our model and consider the appraisal conditions under which the emotion does or does not arise. Now we learn from our model that the emotion you feel depends on how you appraise the situation. This means that if your interpretation is not conducive to compassion, compassion will not arise. And research shows that compassion tends not to arise when the other person is appraised as uncooperative or undeserving, or when you appraise yourself as unable to cope with the situation. These non-conducive conditions can be countered using certain broad groups of practices, many examples of which can be found in secular as well as traditionally religious practices. And what these practices tend to do is adjust our appraisals so that a more positive emotion can arise. Okay, first let's address the situation of seeing the other as uncooperative or undeserving. One broad group of practices for this I'll call perspective taking. For example, imagine being cut off in traffic. Naturally, it makes you want to feel angry. Now, angry can be helpful at some times, but in this case, it's not doing any good for anybody. To trigger reappraisal, you can imagine the other driver's perspective. For example, you may ask yourself, what current circumstances led them to this? Are they in some kind of emergency that they need to get to the exit for? Or if this person really is just a selfish driver, what past suffering might have led them to become selfish in this way? Such imaginings constitute a new stimulus, which initiates a reappraisal of the situation, creating the possibility of a different emotional outcome. Hence, just by taking the perspective of the other person, you may begin to feel anger abate, and a space may open in which compassion may arise. A variation on this is to take a third-person perspective on the situation, which is what happens when a Christian naturalist asks, what would Jesus do? thereby taking the imagined perspective of an ethical role model. Now, others might take the perspective of the Buddhist goddess of compassion, Kuan Yin, or of Martin Luther King, or their own mother, or some other figure. Another group of practices is what I'll call widening circles of concern. Say you find yourself in a heated political discussion. In that moment, there's a temptation to see the other person as an opponent, an enemy. But instead, if you widen your circle of concern to include that other person as part of your in-group, you can see that other person as a partner in democracy. And you may disagree just as vehemently, but the emotion that you feel will be different. Many religious and philosophical practices do precisely this in various ways, often systematically. For example, in Stoicism and ancient Greek philosophy, there is the practice of oikeiosis, or practicing daily to expand care to wider and wider spheres of being, while Confucians live by the 5 relations, where you begin with devotion to family and extend it beyond to village, nation, and eventually to cosmos. And today we might add the ecosystem as well. Buddhists practice loving-kindness meditation, where you gradually extend goodwill, starting with those easiest to feel it toward, and eventually to those for whom it is quite difficult to feel. And we're going to try this later in the course, by the way. Now, when you widen your circles of concern like this, the goals relevant to you are altered, and thus so are your cognitive appraisals. As a result, a different emotional outcome may arise. All right, let's move on to another condition in which compassion does not arise, when you appraise yourself as unable to cope with the situation. In such cases, you end up feeling something called empathic distress. It's basically anxiety that you catch contagiously from the other person, so to speak. And this is what happens to babies in a hospital ward. When one starts crying, they all do. That's what empathic distress is like. Now, one cause of feeling unable to cope is simply rushing. And there's a very interesting study nicknamed the Good Samaritan study by Darley and Batson that shows this clearly. So for this, we can practice just slowing down. You can probably think of many traditionally religious practices that are designed to help you be more calm, collected, and attentive to the present. And these can help you spend less time in a rushed state of mind so that you are in a better opportunity to respond with compassion. Another thing that can cause feeling unable to cope is compassion fatigue, which occurs when you're exposed to too much suffering in the people around you and you just can't muster the capacity to deal with it. Nurses, for example, are often plagued by this, and you end up feeling a sort of numb indifference due to overexposure. Fortunately, there are research-based methods that have been shown to be effective in dealing with compassion fatigue, which can be summed up as self-care. These include stress reduction practices like meditation, maintaining clear boundaries between yourself and the other person, and social support, maintaining a friend network. We should also note that building the tendency to react with positive emotions over time is just like building a muscle. As the compassion muscle gets stronger, you'll be less likely to experience compassion fatigue in the first place. Now, there's an important caveat to be made here when we're talking about influencing our emotions. We should not take the crude and simple view that more emotion is necessarily better. That is not the case. The degree of heart-thumping passion that you actually physically feel is not at all equal to the degree of compassion. In fact, intense emotion often makes the mind clouded, and then you may end up behaving less appropriately. So what we should aim for is not more emotion, but efficient emotion, meaning just enough to achieve the appropriate motivation, but not so much that thought becomes clouded. This may take some experimentation, but the right balance will become apparent in time. So, to sum up, compassion responds to suffering with a desire to help, including bonding over the existential conditions of a naturalistic universe which involves some suffering. It can be cultivated by certain groups of practices. We talked about perspective taking, widening circles of concern, slowing down, and practicing self-care. This way, compassion can become a greater part of your life and you can become a more effective agent in the world.